Our speaker today, Daniel Zeno, is Policy Director at the American Civil Liberties Union of Iowa. He is responsible for implementing the ACLU of Iowa's policy and legislative strategy, including lobbying in the state legislature and working with policymakers at the county and city levels to advance the ACLU's work. Prior to joining the ACLU of Iowa, Daniel represented Iowans living with low incomes in civil cases as a staff attorney at Iowa Legal Aid here in Cedar Rapids. He is a 2009 graduate of the University of Iowa College of Law. He earned a Master of Public Affairs degree from Indiana University Bloomington and a Bachelor of Arts degree in economics from Wabash College. And he is going to be talking to us today about voting rights. So have your questions ready. Welcome, Daniel Zeno.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me? All right. Trying this fancy new clip-on mic. So I'm going to talk about voting rights. This is the simple message. Don't be intimidated. Go vote. Part of the efforts across the country to pass voter ID laws is to confuse people, to intimidate them, to make them feel like voting is hard. So don't be intimidated. Go vote. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Just a quick little note about the ACLU of Iowa. We are a private, nonprofit, nonpartisan organization. We are the state affiliate of the national ACLU. There's an affiliate in all 50 states plus the District of Columbia and Puerto Rico. We are the 5th oldest affiliate in the country, and we work to protect basic freedoms and liberties of all Iowans. In the legislature, which is the work that I do, in the courts, because sometimes you got to sue people to make them do the right thing, and through public education and advocacy. And that's our website, aclu-ia.org. Some of the issues we work on, which makes my work in the legislature kind of busy, because in the last 2 years, the Iowa legislature has been doing a whole lot of stuff, some not so good stuff, some kind of good stuff, on all of these various issues. And that's not an exhaustive list. That's some of the things we work on and care about and want to make sure every Iowan, no matter who they are, where they came from, have their civil liberties protected. So this is what we're going to talk about today. Some of the stuff might be kind of stuff you already know, but we'll go over it anyway. Registering, voter ID, early voting, voting on election day, voting for people with felony convictions, and then we'll have some questions. All right? The message, don't be intimidated. Go vote. 3 things you can do. Register. If you're already registered, check your registration. There's some new rules about if you moved within your precinct, if you have a name change. So before the election, make sure you check your registration, make sure everything's good. You can do that on the Iowa Secretary of State's website or your county auditor's website or in their office. After you register or check your registration, vote. Show up at the polls. You can either vote early through an absentee ballot, either in person or by mail, or vote on election day, which is November 6th, Tuesday. Hope everybody's ready. From 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. If there are any problems at the poll, something doesn't quite work out with your ID, there's some new signature matching requirements. Thank you. Some new signature matching requirements. If anything comes up for the 2018 election, there is an option for an oath. You sign the oath to say, I am who I say I am, I live where I say I live, and you get to cast a regular ballot. Not a provisional ballot, a regular ballot. Right? So that's sort of the message I'd hope you take away from here and that you share with lots of other people. Register or check your registration, vote. If any problems come up, there's the oath. All right. All right, so now we're going to talk about registration. You can go to the next slide. All right, so before Election Day, you can register in person, and the deadline is October 27th. So for all your friends who are not registered, that's the deadline to register. If you're not registered by October 27th, then you got to register on Election Day. Okay? If you register by mail, it has to be in the mail by October 22nd. There's a whole range of ways you can do it: in person, by mail, online, but you have to have an Iowa driver's license or ID to do online. So if you don't have an Iowa driver's license or ID, you can't do the online option. You can also do it when you apply for a variety of services. Next slide. You can also register on Election Day. Again, Tuesday, November 6th. To register on Election Day, you got to prove identity and residency. You can do those two things by using one document. So if your Iowa driver's license shows your identity and also has your current address, you did what you needed to do. If they don't, then you got to prove identity and then separately prove residency. You can prove identity using these documents. None of this stuff, by the way, was changed by the voter ID law, right? So the registration part, that was not changed by the voter ID law. So all of this is the same that it was before the voter ID law passed, okay? We'll go to the next slide. So these are the documents you can use to prove residency. Now including a cell phone bill, by the way. So for anybody who needs to show residency, you can use, if your cell phone bill shows your current address, you can use that as a document as well. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So let's talk about voter ID. We'll go to the next slide. All right, as I'll assume most of us know, new voter ID law went into effect in 2018. Okay, it did a whole lot of things. I'm going to talk about primarily the ID part, a little bit about signature verification. But I mean, what they called the Election Integrity Act was about voter ID and signature verification and shortening early voting and the time periods for when candidates have to submit their nominating papers and post-election. I mean, the bill covered a whole range of things, right? We're going to, like I said, primarily focus on these things. You may have heard there was a lawsuit filed related to voter ID. We're going to talk a little bit about that lawsuit. That lawsuit blocks some parts of the law specifically dealing with early voting. The lawsuit didn't challenge voter ID specifically. So the lawsuit is not about voter ID itself. It's about some other things in the voter ID law. Okay? Next slide. So for the 2018 election, poll workers will ask for ID. The law says they now have to ask for ID. For 2018, you are not required to show ID. That is important to know. You are not required to show ID. They're going to ask. You are not required to show it. If you'd like to show it, you are welcome to do that. There's nothing wrong with you showing it, but you are not required to. And that's part of the don't be intimidated. Because the law was written in this sort of confusing way that in 2018, poll workers will ask you for the ID, but you don't have to show it. And then 2019, they'll ask you, but you do have to show it. And it's sort of this like the state wagging their finger at you in 2018 saying, be prepared, next year you're going to have to show your ID, right? But the reality is you do not have to show an ID for the 2018 election. And that's an important message that we want to make sure everybody knows. Again, if you want to show ID, you're welcome to do that. And if you do, then you got to do that residency and identity thing. So you got to prove both of those things. So we'll go to the next slide. And again, it's the same documents, right? And another important point, a lot of what the Secretary of State's office has been putting out has focused on the Iowa driver's license or ID. That is one of the options. There are a whole lot of other options, right? And so if you know people, you go to friends, family, other groups you're a part of, one, you don't have to show an ID for 2018, but if you want to, you got options. It's not just the Iowa driver's license or the Iowa ID card. They did add the tribal ID in 2018. because they didn't include that when they initially passed the voter ID law. And that would be a huge problem if we said to First Nations people who live right here in Iowa, you can't use your tribal ID issued by the government that governs you to vote in the state of Iowa. So they fixed that and included tribal ID in 2018. Okay, we'll go to the next slide. And again, these are the documents for residency. And you only need to use these if your photo ID doesn't include your current address. So if the ID that you show has your current address, you don't need to worry about this part. But if it doesn't, then you gotta use a residency, a document to prove residency. We'll go to the next slide. All right, so if you don't have an ID, or if you decide, you know what, I don't really want to show my ID, which you have the right to do, and anything comes up. All right, we'll use the example that you do have an ID. And the poll worker says, we'll use an extreme example, the picture in your ID doesn't quite look like you. Or, part of the law is there has to be signature matching. So the signature on your ID has to match the signature that you just signed on the election log. And the poll worker says, I don't think your signature matches. Now, if we step back for a second, my signature changes depending on if I'm rushing, or if it's a busy day, or when I got my driver's license, if I was very concerned and I signed very properly. When I go to the polls, I just kind of quickly sign. And that's just me. I think most of us, our signature changes based on a whole lot of circumstances. If you're an Iowan with a disability, maybe you didn't have a disability when you got your license and now you do. Or maybe you're an older Iowan, maybe your signature changed. And now that Iowa's moving to this system where, so I went renew my driver's license, I don't have to renew for 5 years. My signature from 5 years ago may not be the same as my signature today, for a whole lot of reasons. And so let's say that situation comes up, and the poll worker says, no, your signature doesn't match. I don't think you can, this won't work. You can't vote. The oath. And this is only for the calendar year 2018. In the voter ID law, it says a person may sign an oath saying, so first it says the poll worker must ask if you have an ID. We encourage people to show ID. This is what the law says. We encourage people to show ID, but if you don't have one, you can sign this oath. Okay? So the oath just says, yes, I am Daniel Zeno, and I live where I said I live. You sign the oath, and then you get a regular ballot. There are two other options. One is having an attester, so a neighbor, a friend, a person who knows you, a registered voter in your precinct who says, yeah, I know Daniel. That is, his name actually is Daniel. He is Daniel. He does live where he said he lived. And then they sign, and then you sign. So that's another option. And then the third option is to cast a provisional ballot. Provisional ballots, you cast them, they don't count unless you come back. Even if you do come back, they might still not count. I think most of us know just getting people to the polls the first time is a challenge. So the idea that somebody would come back to the polls within 3 days. And so the provisional ballot is an option, less of a real viable option, right? But so if anything comes up, again, you got two options, the oath and the attester. The oath is only for 2018. January 1, 2019, the oath goes away. That's not an option anymore. Why? You'd have to ask the legislators who passed that law and said, we're going to give people this option, this real option, for people who might not have an ID for a whole lot of reasons, but only for 1 year, for the fundamental right to vote, right? So those are two options, but the oath is going to go away in 2019. We'll go to the next slide. All right, and then this is part of a bigger presentation. I did this at Coe College earlier this week, so I included this part. So students. There's been a whole lot of stuff about students. What do they need to do? So students can, in Iowa, under Iowa law, students can either register and vote in Iowa or register and vote in their home state. Student gets to pick. You can't do both, but you get to pick either one. And so a student who is from, let's say, my home state of the great state of Louisiana, who is going to college in Iowa, they can register to vote in Iowa. They'd have to follow all the rules to register in Iowa. In terms of voter ID, same requirements for students. Students do have to show and again, the Secretary of State focuses a lot on the Iowa driver's license or ID card. A student who's from Louisiana can use their Louisiana driver's license with their lease or a document from their college saying, this person lives in dorm X at this address, right? So that's an important piece because there's a lot of confusion about what students need to do. All IDs for the voter ID purpose have to be current and with an expiration date. So generally speaking, students can't use their student ID from their college because their college doesn't write an expiration date on it. So we'll go to the next slide. All right, early voting. In this section, I'm going to talk about that lawsuit. All right, so you can vote early. It's going to start soon. Monday. There we go. You fill out a ballot or an application. You get a ballot. You can either mail it back in or bring it back to your county auditor's office. Right? You can get the application from the Secretary of State's website. And at the end of this, I'm going to show you the Secretary of State's website because there's a whole lot of stuff you can do. Request a ballot, track your ballot, check your registration, find your precinct. You can do all of that stuff on the Secretary of State's website. Next slide. All right, the lawsuit. So LULAC, League of United Latin American Citizens, I think it's the acronym, filed a lawsuit challenging some parts of the voter ID law. Again, they didn't challenge the specific requirement to have an ID, but they challenged some other parts to it. The district court issued a temporary injunction stopping certain parts of the law. The state then appealed, and the Iowa Supreme Court affirmed the temporary injunction. So the temporary injunction is in place right now and will be in place until the lawsuit is done. So they're still litigating it. They still have some hearings. They still got to go to trial. But while the litigation is going on, there's a temporary injunction. And it does primarily three things. So here's what the lawsuit challenged. Signature verification for absentee ballot applications and absentee ballots themselves. So the voter ID law has two signature verification pieces. If you vote by absentee ballot, there's a matching from the signature on the absentee ballot and the application and the signature form when you registered. And then on election day, the signature on your ID and the signature form you signed. The lawsuit did not challenge the signature verification on election day. So that part is still in place. So on election day, when you go up to the polls, the poll workers will be doing signature matching. For early voting, the lawsuit said, we're challenging that part of it. We're challenging that signature matching for the application and the ballot. The second thing they challenged is on the ballot, absentee ballot application, voter ID law required that you include a voter verification number or your ID number. Does anybody know what that means? And then the third thing they challenged was the voter ID law said, if you submit your absentee ballot application and you don't include some information, but the county auditor, when they get your application, they're looking at it and they're looking at their computer screen and they see the information, for example, your apartment number. The voter ID law said your county auditor cannot use the information that they already have, that you already provided to them. They cannot take that information and put it on your application. They have to mail the application back to you, and then you have to update it and then mail it back to them. So that's another part that the lawsuit challenged. We'll go to the next slide. So what does this all mean? The temporary injunction, by the way, the lawsuit also challenged the shortening of early voting from 40 days to 29 days. The court granted a temporary injunction for those first three parts that I just talked about, but not the shortening of early voting. So early voting is still going to be 29 days this year instead of 40. By the way, when this was being debated in the legislature, in the Senate, one of the, and I note the party of the legislator simply as a factual matter, not to be partisan. So a Democratic senator asked the Republican floor manager, why are we shortening early voting? Well, like, what's the reason to do this? And the answer was 29 days is still longer than most, a longer time period than most other states. And it's, yeah, that was the reason. I was going to give another reason, but that's for another part. It's still longer than most other states, to which the Democratic senator responded, well, that's good, but that's still not a reason to lower the bar in Iowa. It's okay to be a leader. It's okay to lead and say, we're going to do better than everybody else. The other part, in the voter ID law, it also eliminated straight party voting. See, that's no longer an option. You can't do straight party voting, so you got to fill out all the options, flip the page over and fill out all the options. Again, the question was asked why, and the response was to help the Libertarian Party, at which point literally everybody in the chamber laughed because everybody knew that wasn't the real reason. So back to the lawsuit. So what is the temporary injunction? What does it mean? So now, your county auditor can count your absentee ballot even if your signature doesn't match. So they're not doing signature matching on absentee ballots. They're still doing it on election day, but not on absentee ballots. If you request an absentee ballot and don't include the voter verification number or ID number because you didn't quite know what number they were talking about, or if you don't include that, your county auditor can still accept your application, right? And then the third thing, if you submit your application and it doesn't include some information, your county auditor can do what I think most people would say is pretty common sense. Use the information that you already gave them that they have in their computer system to complete the application, okay? So that's the lawsuit. I just looked this morning. They're still, doing litigation. I think there's a trial, a conference to get all the parties together to plan for the trial that is coming up in the coming week. So that lawsuit is still going on. While that lawsuit is going on, this temporary injunction is going to stay in place until the end, where the judge is going to make a final decision. Okay? So that's the lawsuit. We'll go to the next slide. All right, now we're going to talk about voting on Election Day. November 6th, Tuesday, November 6th, Tuesday, November 6th, Tuesday, November 6th. All right. Polls open 7 a.m. to 9 p.m. You have to vote at your assigned polling place. And we know those change sometimes, so make sure you check beforehand so you're in the right place. Again, on the Secretary of State's website, your county auditor's website, or their office. Again, they're going to ask for ID. You don't have to show it. You can if you'd like to. The reason for ID, the reason that they give for saying you have to show ID, is something about election integrity and stopping voter fraud. The Secretary of State himself, the chief elections officer in the state of Iowa, has said there's no voter fraud in Iowa. Independent research shows Iowa has one of the best election systems in the country. So this really is a way to make voting harder, more confusing. And this ID part, intimidate people so they don't show up. Another way that this works into attempting to suppress the vote, it's the signature matching piece. So I'll give you two examples, one using the Iowa law and one using the Texas law. So the Iowa law says your signature has to match. So I'm a black person from Louisiana. Black people literally were killed to get the right to vote. When I show up at the polls, voting matters to me. And if something comes up, I'm not just going to walk away. We're going to figure this out. That might take 10 minutes, but I'm not leaving because we're going to figure this out. The result is people in the line. The parent who picked up the kid, who has 20 minutes because there's some other things, and they just need to quickly run in and hopefully get in and vote. But I'm at the desk for 10 minutes. And then the next person shows up and they're at the desk for 10 minutes. And now the parents are like, voting's really important, but life, kids, there's things. And then people start leaving the line. So that's one way that these requirements not only intimidate people to not show up in the first place, but when they do show up, discourage them from being there. So the Texas law says your name has to match. So it's not just signature, but your name. So in Texas, there's lots of stories and data showing disproportionate impact on women. So women who have been married or divorced or changed a name for a variety of reasons, or people who have junior as their part of their last name, or when they got their ID, they wrote the initial of their middle name, but then when they registered, they didn't include the initial of their middle name. And again, people show up. And similarly, women say, we fought for the right to vote. I am not leaving this line. The fact that I got divorced this year and my name changed is not going to stop me from voting. And then she's at the desk for 7 minutes. And then the next woman is at the desk for 6 minutes, right? And then people in the line start saying, I've been standing here for 15 minutes. I really want to vote, but there are 20 people ahead of me. I've been in line for 20 minutes. I really only had 30 minutes to make all this happen. Do I really stay in the line? I know this is important. And some people stay, and then some people say, you know what, I can't. I got to go. And then they don't vote. Not because they weren't eligible, not because they didn't care, not because they didn't want to, but because the process was set up to make it harder for them, right? And so that's part of what's happening in this, and I think we all know this, but that's part of what's happening in this passing voter ID laws. So we'll go back to the slide. We'll go to the next slide. All right. Some things about voting, or voting on election day. Your polling place must be accessible for people with disabilities. If not, you should ask your county auditor for an accommodation. If you can't enter the poll place, you have the right to ask that a poll worker come to your car and bring the ballot to you. Okay? You also have the right to have anyone, with an asterisk, you choose to help you at the poll, including going in the voting booth with you. Right? So if you have a seeing disability or some other kind of disability or whatever the reason is and you want somebody to help you, you have the right to do that. The people you cannot have in there are your employer, an agent or representative of your employer, or an agent or representative of a labor union, of the union that you're in. Okay? Poll workers themselves are also required to help you even in the voting booth. So if you say, I came by myself, but I'd like somebody to help me. Can you just, read the first elective office, read the names, right? The poll workers are required to help you. And we'll go to the next slide. You also have the right to bring an interpreter to the polls or get help from anyone in your language from anyone you choose, again, with those same caveats. So not your employer, an agent or representative of your employer, or an agent or representative of the labor union that you're in. You can also bring kids into the voting booth. Important civics education, bringing kids to the polls, showing them that voting matters. And polls close at 9. If you're in line when the polls close, you still are allowed the right to vote. We'll go to the next slide. Time off. You may be able to take time off for work. If you can't, if you don't have time, you can get up to 3 consecutive hours. You have to give your employer notice, but your employer gets to pick the 3-hour period. But you do have the right to do that, right? And so this is important for, the many of us in our communities who don't quite have the privilege to just take off of work whenever they want. Some of us can do that, right? Like I could leave work and take 4 hours if that's how long it took for me to go vote. Some people don't have that privilege, and so this allows them to be able to take up to 3 consecutive hours to go make sure they can vote. And then your employer may also can't penalize you for doing that, for taking that 3-hour period. We'll go to the next slide. All right, voting for people with felony convictions, and then we'll get to questions. All right, as many of you know, Iowa is one of only 3 states that automatically takes and permanently takes away a person's right to vote upon a conviction of a felony. Iowa, Kentucky, Florida. In November of this year, there's a ballot initiative in Florida to change that. So Iowa could be one of 2 states. There's this thing in generally southern states, so being a good Louisiana resident, there's this thing where you're like, well, but at least we're not in Mississippi, which is a little bit offensive to Mississippi. I bring that up because, right now, in this circumstance, 47 states can say, well, at least we're not Iowa, which is sad. The only way to restore your vote in Iowa is to apply to the governor. That process requires that you complete an application. You are current on your fines and fees. You get a report from the DCI, from the Department of Public Safety, and pay a $15 fee to get that report from DCI. By the way, all of the information is already on Iowa Courts Online for free. And the Iowa Supreme Court has said Iowa Courts Online is the official electronic docket of the Iowa court system. And then after you do all of that, you have to sign the document that says, I certify under penalty of perjury, a felony, that everything is true and complete. And so while the application is 1 page, so that the governor's office will say this, it's only 1 page long. There are lots of people who are hesitant to sign a form that says it is true and complete, because what if I missed something, not intending to, although if you can likely argue I didn't intend to, and so I shouldn't be convicted of perjury. But people are concerned about that, and so I believe around 200 or so people have gotten their right to vote back since about 2011, which is a pretty small number. For a whole lot of reasons. People, fewer people apply. Generally, people start thinking about voting when election time comes. Generally speaking, whoever the governor is generally not interested in restoring votes right around the election time. So there's a lot of reasons to that. So we'll go to the next slide. Quickly, ACLU has a guide on our website that has the application, this whole table, charts, all of the forms you need, everything you need to get your right to vote restored. So I'm not going to go through that, but that information is available on the website. And we'll go to the next slide. Questions. So go one more slide.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, yeah. So some resources, but also I will answer questions.
Yes. Okay, so who's got a question? Since I've got one right here, I'm going to hand off the mic.
You can go 2 slides up.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us today. My question is with regard to the slide referring to taking time off.
Yes.
And your 3-hour request for that. I understand that it can be a request submitted to an employer, but can it also be submitted to an educational institution? Say you're a university student that has an evening class and you work on top of that and your only availability is to vote in the evening, but maybe you have an evening class that would prohibit you from making it to the polls.
I don't believe Iowa law says your school or your college. It specifically says your employer. And generally speaking, I think most college professors would be open. I think most colleges have been helpful and useful in helping their students register, get to the polls, vote, do what they can. But the law doesn't specifically say you can ask off for like class.
Okay, the next question is back here in the back. Hold it close to your mouth.
The next to the last slide where you were showing
And we can go
information
back
about convicted felons getting their right back, is that something that's pending? That's something that you're attempting? The ACLU is going for?
So we are working to try to address this problem. So what this slide is showing is if a person right now has a felony conviction, there were lots of iterations of this. And so before 2005, so July 4, 2005 is when Governor Vilsack issued an executive order essentially restoring the voting rights for everybody prior to that date. Okay? So that's why that if you were convicted of a felony and finished your sentence before that date, you automatically have the right to vote back. Between then, 2005 and 2011, so during that period what was happening is, this was during Governor Vilsack and then Governor Culver, when people were, after you finish your sentence, the Department of Corrections would send a list to the governor's office. The governor would then send basically a certificate to people saying your right to vote has been restored. So in that period, 2005 to 2011, most people got their right to vote back. We have heard stories of during the transition from the Culver administration to the Branstad administration, the Department of Corrections had sent the list, but people didn't get the certification. So there are a group of people who didn't get that certificate, and if you didn't get that certificate, your right to vote wasn't restored. So that in that period, that's why we suggest people call the governor's office. And then after that, July 11, 2011, first executive order of Governor Branstad, ending that process. Okay? So after January 11, 2011, you have to apply. You have to take steps. Okay? To try to fix that, we have been focused on, there's 3 different ways to do it. So one is trying to get the governor to issue a new executive order. Because any governor can issue an executive order anytime. Right? And it's election season, this is about voting, and so we are less convinced that Governor Reynolds, or any governor for that matter, would be interested in doing something. That being said, we have plans to talk to whoever wins to say this is an important issue. You are the governor of the state of Iowa, and you can fix this temporarily right now. That solution is, not permanent because the governor can change the executive order. A new governor can issue a new executive order. So the second part is legislation. So in the Kelly Griffin case, the Iowa Supreme Court, this was about this specific issue. The Iowa Supreme Court said, voting is a fundamental right, but the legislature may change the definition of infamous crime in code, but the court reserves the right to make a pass judgment on that. It's a little bit quirky because generally speaking, when you have a fundamental right, the legislature can't just change it. And so that part is a little bit quirky, but that's an option. And then the final option is change the Iowa Constitution, which is a much longer process. But we're working on all 3 of those pieces. So yeah.
Okay, next question back here.
I have 2 questions.
Yes.
The first question is, it seems to me that this new law provides more discretion to poll workers in terms of challenging people's right to vote. So my first question is do you agree with that? Is that true? And my second question following that is, if it is true, it seems to me that discretion opens the opportunity for disparity and discrimination. And if that is happening, how are we going to know that it's happening?
And so, yeah, I think it is true. And that's exactly one of the points we argued when they were debating the bill is, and it's more than just discretion. Poll workers are not trained to match signatures. You have untrained volunteers who do fantastic work, right? We appreciate the fact that people in our communities volunteer to make sure elections happen. That's a good thing. But unpaid volunteers who are not trained to match signatures, being able to do something that could negatively impact a person's right to vote is a real problem, right? And one of the examples we gave when we were lobbying was, imagine a person who has a last name that is from, let's say, a Central American country, where there are, multiple last names or dash last names, and for whatever reason, the poll worker says, I'm going to look at these signatures a little bit more than I look at all the other ones, right? Discrimination. How do we know it happens? I mean, people report it. People call the ACLU. People call their county auditor. People contact attorneys. People talk to advocacy groups. But that's part of the big picture of voter ID is making it so that now it's on the person who has potentially been discriminated against to do all of this hard work just to vote. Next question.
Okay, next question is
All right.
back here.
Yes, sir. Two questions. One, what would be involved in making Election Day a holiday? And secondly, could a Secretary of State who wanted to do so simplify the voting process, or are we left with what the legislature does?
So to make Election Day a state holiday would likely require, I actually don't know. I don't know that it would require legislation. I don't know. That's a good question. I'll think about that one. The second part, I think it is true. So one, the voter ID law exists. We opposed it when it was in the legislature. It is the law right now. So that's what we have right now. That being said, the Secretary of State's office has the ability to issue administrative rules. And when the Secretary of State's office did that, we offered comments because there were ways that the Secretary of State's office, we felt, was making the voter ID law even more restrictive than the voter ID law itself made voting, right? And so there is a whole lot of, there are ways that the Secretary of State's office can issue administrative rules that make it sort of less onerous. The current Secretary of State was the primary proponent of the voter ID law, so it is unlikely that he would be the Secretary of State to do that. But that is an option, right, that the Secretary of State could, for example, signature matching. The law just says you have to match signatures. What does that mean? If they kind of look like, does it match? Right, the Secretary of State could issue regulations that say, unless it is clear and obvious that they don't match, they match. Or the Secretary of State's office could say, poll workers must scrutinize every signature because the law requires that they match. Right, and so there's some room for the administrative rules to make the law less bad.
One comment about signature matching. In all the years I've been alive, I've never seen that used ever. I don't even understand why it would be a viable concept, so you could comment on that. And then if we were in a best practice situation, getting 100% of the voters out to the polls, what would our law look like?
I mean, so we think so the first part, the signature matching thing, I agree. Again, I think it's just a way to make things a little bit more difficult. What would, best case scenario voting rights laws look like? They would make it easy for people to participate in the process. We already have a process in Iowa where you register. You don't necessarily need an ID to register. You can put your last four of your social security number. You register. We then send you an acknowledgement card to your address. We got your identity and your residency. You've registered. When you show up at the polls, you've done everything you needed to do to prove that you are who you are and you live where you live. You show up and you vote. Right? It's that simple, right? The idea that we make you register and then give your address and then mail a card to you and then you get it at your address so we know you live there, and then you show up at the polls and we say, wait, where do you live again? Right? It's just a way to make things more difficult, to make it so that groups of people who are less likely to vote won't show up.
I don't have a question, but I just wanted to indicate that we do have satellite stations around, and they are starting this coming Monday.
Okay.
The last time I tried to vote last fall, or 2 years ago for the 2016, I usually try to go before work.
Okay.
And they've changed it again now so that the workers that are there have to use iPads to use the internet to verify your information, and the iPads weren't working, the internet wasn't working, and I stood there for 15 minutes, and I had to leave and go to work, and I did go after work and vote, but when did this iPad thing start and internet connectivity? Is that going to be something that can be addressed?
So the voter ID law does require, the voter ID law says every polling place must check every voter through the felon voting database. Generally, that's easier if you do it electronically, and so it's sort of an encouragement for counties to get the electronic system. That's a huge issue for exactly what you said, and also because there are parts of Iowa where fast internet doesn't exist. And so that is a big issue that we've been thinking a whole lot about and trying to figure out how do we, again, in the voter ID law, it's not a requirement, but it is essentially if your county or your polling place doesn't use that electronic system and check you through the felon database, you could potentially have to cast a provisional ballot. So in Polk County, there's a pretty big precinct because these systems are pretty expensive, and you need them for each polling place. So there are polling places in Polk County that don't have this system. There are places in Blackhawk County where they have them in some precincts, but not all of them. And so there's at least the potential that thousands of people could have to use a provisional ballot just because the county couldn't afford to get the system. So it's a big issue. There's also potential for hacking, right? And so thinking about, how do we make sure our elections are secure, and also a way to make sure that we can check, right? And so this issue of electronic voting, using electronic databases, and of course technology is a good thing, and the goal is not to say let's not use technology, because there are good and useful ways to use technology, but we got to do it in a way that protects privacy and make sure we can ensure that elections are secure, and also make sure there's a way we can go back and check.
Dark money. I saw on TV about an hour and a half program about dark money. Mm-hmm. And there's big money people like the Koch brothers that they're just corrupt. That's the impression I got from it. And then the voting is so violently vicious, important, everybody must vote. Mm-hmm. How is it them big money guys can spread the money around and cheat the whole system? Furthermore, I'd like to know how it is that our man Trumpster is our president and he did not win that election.
Thank you, James. Now let's let him answer.
Money in politics, Donald Trump being the president, we'll leave those for another day. Those are big, huge issues.
Well, I have people leaping up here and start swinging at one another. Because that man Trumpster, in my opinion, is, I don't know how to describe that.
Thank you, James. Thank you, James. Next question back here.
Is it true that states that have all vote by mail have higher participation voter rates, and are there less hassles then in those states?
And that I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I do want to point out there's a question in the front here.
Okay, I've got one over there. But I've got one right here.
Okay.
Sorry. Just a quick question. Does Iowa have a way of performing recounts?
Yes.
Good.
And in the voter ID law, there is so it's not a recount, but there is a post-election audit. So essentially the Secretary of State's office will audit particular counties. The Secretary, the way the law is written is a little bit less good because the Secretary has some discretion and there's at least some concern that if you have a Republican Secretary of State, they will pick the Democratic counties. If you have a Democratic Secretary of State, they'll pick the Republican counties. Because there's no requirement that they, randomly pick the counties or pick a big county and a small county. It just says pick some. And so while that exists, there's some concern that it could be used for political purposes and not to actually ensure that the election went well.
Representative Archstay, Democrat, and I wanted to thank you, Daniel, and ACLU for sticking up for people's rights, and particularly with these voting rights. So it's difficult to sit here and see this reviewed again. We spent so many hours in the House trying to defeat this.
Yes.
And as you mentioned before, the answers were non-answers. When we asked them questions about why you were doing this, there was no research that showed that any of it was true. There was no impact or any kind of studies that favored it. So we knew that it was an attempt to suppress the vote, particularly those that are minorities, elderlies, even students, which many on the floor at that time were talking about being liberal. So I guess our more educated students that go to our universities and so on are more liberal and tend to vote Democratic. I'm not sure that's true, but they wanted to make sure, I think, that was suppressed. So this was not something that came out of Iowa. It came from somewhere else. It doesn't apply to Iowa. It set us back ages in terms of our voting rights. And I think that what we should be doing is voting to make it simpler to vote, easy to register, if not automatic registration. And as I mentioned, by some voting, we should be able to do by mail. So we have a system that worked and has worked well for years and years, and there was no reason for this. When those floor leaders stood on the floor in the House, in particular someone here from Marion, and when he stood on the House floor and he was asked the questions about this, he would just stand and not answer. It was something that you couldn't compel a legislator to do, to answer those questions. And so it went without reason, without proof, and here we are. And so the answer is to get out and vote. I hope every one of you have a plan for next week to do early voting so that those lines are not long and that you get your vote in. And I want to thank you again for clarifying all this for everyone. One last comment, and you can maybe answer a question. I've run into at least 2 constituents with felony convictions, but they were out of state.
Okay.
One particular in Mississippi, and he didn't serve his full sentence because his sentence was commuted, I believe.
Okay.
And so the runaround, the bureaucracy of him trying to get the information to the governor, he's given up after 4 or 5 years.
Yeah. And so in the restoration of voting rights application, it does require that you list every felony you've been convicted of in Iowa and in other states. And so, again, even though the governor's office says the form is 1 page long, the process of gathering that information is not always easy, right? I mean, Iowa now has an electronic court filing system across the entire state. That is not true in every state. There are some states where you need to go to the courthouse and get the paper document. And if it's, from a while back, the court may have it in storage. And so just getting information, getting documents sometimes is the hardest part.
We have the last question here.
Thank you. In the case of disabled voters, not every disability is obvious, and not every disability has to do with mobility. You don't necessarily have a walker, a cane, or a wheelchair, but you may need help. If you're asking the poll worker for help, and they don't see the walker, the cane, or the wheelchair, and they aren't inclined to give you that help, what is your recourse?
So if, let's say you're on election day, you're at the polls, I would suggest first, can we call the county auditor's office? Generally speaking, most county auditor's office, they exist to make sure people can vote, right? So call the county auditor's office. If, they're less receptive, you can contact us. I know Disability Rights Iowa, which is a statewide organization, would also, be able to help. So I think, in that moment, contact the county auditor's office, ACLU. I assume the political parties also would have, observers at the polling place, depending on what political party you may or may not subscribe to. Talk to them, but essentially talk to somebody to make sure you get the help you need, because the law says the poll worker is supposed to help you. That doesn't mean that always happens, but that's what the law says. My information is there. Feel free to send me an email, take a look at our website. Yeah.
Help me thank Daniel Zeno.